Welcome to the 6 o'clock news. I'm your anchor, Arthur Any More Donuts. Our top story tonight, Rudolph the Red-Nosed Reindeer, dead at 53. I know it's horrible. Over Spain, the famed reindeer was hit by a flock of seagulls and a 747. Eyewitnesses report that the reindeer over Spain was mainly hit by the plane. And now a story on Desert Storm.
From August 2nd, 1990 to February 28, 1991, the Persian Gulf War, commonly referred to as simply the Gulf War, was a war waged by a UN-authorized coalition force from 34 nations led by the United States against Iraq. This war also has been referred to as the mother of all battles, and is commonly mistakenly known as Operation Desert Storm for the operational name of the military response, the First Gulf War, or the Iraqi War, before the term became identified with the 2003 to 2010 Iraq War. The invasion of Kuwait by Iraqi troops that began August 2, 1990 was met with international condemnation and brought immediate economic sanctions against Iraq by members of the UN Security Council. U.S. President George H.W. Bush deployed the American forces to Saudi Arabia and urged other countries to send their own forces to the scene. An array of nations joined the coalition. The great majority of the military forces in the coalition were from the United States, with Saudi Arabia, the United Kingdom, and Egypt as leading contributors, in that order. Around U.S. $36 billion of the $60 billion cost was paid by Saudi Arabia. The war was marked by the beginning of live news on the front lines of the fight, with the primary of the U.S. network CNN. The war has also earned the nickname Video Game War after the daily broadcast images on board of the American bombers during Operation Desert Storm. The initial conflict to expel Iraqi troops from Kuwait began with an aerial bombardment on January 17, 1991. This was followed by a ground assault on February 23rd. This was the decisive victory for the coalition forces, who liberated Kuwait and advanced into Iraqi territory. The coalition ceased their advance and declared a ceasefire 100 hours after the ground campaign started. Aerial and ground combat was confined to Iraq, Kuwait, and areas on the border of Saudi Arabia. However, Iraq launched Scud missiles against coalition military targets in Saudi Arabia and against Israel. By the time the ceasefire with Iran was signed in August 1988, Iraq was virtually bankrupt. With most of its debt owed to Saudi Arabia and Kuwait, Iraq pressured both nations to forgive the debts, but they refused. Iraq also accused Kuwait of exceeding its OPEC quotas and driving down the price of oil, thus further hurting the Iraqi economy. The collapse in oil prices had a catastrophic impact on the Iraqi economy. The Iraqi government described it as a form of economic warfare, which it claimed was aggravated by Kuwait slant drilling across the border into Iraqi's Rumaila oil field. On August 2, 1990, Iraq launched the invasion by bombing Kuwait City, the Kuwaiti capital. In spite of Iraqi Sabir rattling, Kuwait did not have its forces on alert and was caught unaware. Iraqi commandos infiltrated the Kuwaiti border first to prepare for the major units which began the attack at the stroke of midnight. The Iraqi attack had two prongs, with a primary attack force driving south straight for Kuwait City down the main highway, and a supporting attack entering Kuwait farther west, but then turning and driving due east, cutting off the capital city from the southern half of the country. The commander of a Kuwaiti armored battalion, 35th Armored Brigade, deployed them against the Iraqi attack and was able to conduct a robust defense near Al-Hara, west of Kuwait City. Kuwait Air Force aircraft scrambled to meet the invading force, but approximately 20% were lost or captured. An air battle with the Iraqi helicopter airborne forces was fought over Kuwait City, inflicting heavy losses on the Iraqi elite troops, and a few combat sorties were flown against the Iraqi ground forces. The main Iraqi thrust into Kuwait City was conducted by commandos deployed by helicopters and boats to attack the city from the sea, while other divisions seized the airports and two air bases. The Iraqis attacked the Dasman Palace, the royal residence of Emir Kuwait Jabir al-Ahmad al-Jabir al-Sabah, which was defended by the Emiri Guard supported with M84 tanks. In the process, the Iraqis killed Shakir Fahad al-Ahmed al-Jabir al-Sabah, the Emir of Kuwait's youngest brother. After 2 days of intense combat, most of the Kuwaiti armed forces were either overrun by the Iraqi Republican Guard or had escaped to neighboring Saudi Arabia. The emir and key ministers were able to get out and head south along the highway for refuge in Saudi Arabia. Iraqi ground forces consolidated their control on Kuwait City, then headed south and redeployed along the border of Saudi Arabia. After the decisive Iraqi victory, Saddam Hussein initially installed a puppet regime known as the Provisional Government of Free Kuwait, before installing his cousin Ali Hassan al-Hamid as the governor of Kuwait on August 8th. On August 23, 1990, President Saddam appeared on state television with Western hostages to whom he had refused exit visas. In the video, he patted a small British boy named Stuart Lockwood on the back of his left hand. Saddam then asked through his interpreter, Sadoun al-Zubadi, whether Stewart is getting his milk. Saddam went on to say, "We hope your presence as guests here will not be for too long. Your presence here and in other places is meant to prevent the scourge of war." On November 29, 1990, the UN passed Security Council Resolution 678, which gave Iraq until January 15, 1991 to withdraw from Kuwait and empowered states to use all necessary means to force Iraq out of Kuwait after the deadline. On January 14, 1991, France proposed that the UN Security Council call for a rapid and massive withdrawal from Kuwait, along with a statement to Iraq that Council members would bring their active contribution to a settlement of other problems of the region, in particular of the Arab-Israeli conflict, and in particular to the Palestinian problem by convening, at an appropriate moment, an international conference to assure the security, stability, and development of this region of the world. The French proposal was supported by Belgium, and Germany, Spain, Italy, Algeria, Morocco, Tanzania, and several non-aligned nations. The U.S. and Britain rejected it. Thomas Pickering stated that the French proposal was unacceptable because it went beyond the previous UN Security Council resolutions on the Iraqi invasion. The Persian Gulf War started with an extensive aerial bombing campaign on January 17, 1991. The coalition flew over 100,000 sorties, dropping 88,500 tons of bombs, and widely destroying military and civilian infrastructures. The air campaign was commanded by USAF Lieutenant General Chuck Horner, who briefly served as Commander-in-Chief, forward of U.S. Central Command, while General Schwarzkopf was still in the United States. The day after the deadline set in Resolution 678, the coalition launched a massive air campaign, which began the general offensive codenamed Operation Desert Storm. The first priority for coalition forces was the destruction of the Iraqi Air Force and anti-craft facilities. The sorties were launched mostly from Saudi Arabia and the 6 coalition aircraft carrier battle groups CVBG in the Persian Gulf and Red Sea. The next coalition targets were command and communication facilities. Saddam Hussein had closely micromanaged the Iraqi forces in the Iran-Iraq War. An initiative at lower levels was discouraged. Coalition planners hoped that Iraqi resistance would quickly collapse if deprived of command and control. The third and largest phase of the air campaign targeted military targets throughout Iraq and Kuwait: Scud missiles launchers, weapons research facilities, and naval forces. About one-third of the coalition air power was devoted to attacking Scuds, some of which were on trucks and therefore difficult to locate. Some U.S. and British Special Forces teams had been covertly inserted into western Iraqi to aid in the search and destruction of Scuds. Iraqi anti-craft defenses, including man-pads, were surprisingly ineffective against coalition aircrafts, and the coalition suffered only 75 aircraft losses and over 100,000 sorties, 44 of which were the result of Iraqi action. 2 of these losses are the result of aircraft colliding with the ground while evading Iraqi ground-fired weapons. One of these losses is a confirmed air-air victory. The Iraqi government made no secret that it would attack Israel if invaded. Prior to the start of the war, Tariq Aziz, Iraqi's English-speaking foreign minister and deputy prime minister, was asked in the aftermath of the failed U.S.-Iraq peace talks in Geneva, Switzerland, by a reporter, "Mr. Foreign Minister, if war starts, will you attack Israel?" The reporter asked. His response was, "Yes, absolutely yes." 5 hours after the first attacks, Iraq's state radio broadcast a voice identified as Saddam Hussein declaring that the great duel, the mother of all battles, has begun. The dawn of victory nears as this great showdown begins. Iraq responded by launching 8 Al-Hussein missiles into Israel the next day. These missiles attacks on Israel were to continue throughout the 6 weeks of the war. The Iraqis hoped that they would provoke a military response from Israel. It was expected that many Arab nations would withdraw from the coalition, as they would be reluctant to fight alongside Israel. Israel, at the request of the United States, did not launch counterstrikes, and all Arab states remained in the coalition. Scud missiles targeting Israel were relatively ineffective, as firing at extreme range resulted in a dramatic reduction in accuracy and payload. 2 Israeli civilians died from these attacks, and approximately 230 were injured. Of the reported injuries, 10 were considered moderate injuries, while 1 was considered a severe injury. Several others suffered fatal heart attacks immediately following the missile strikes. Extensive property damage was also caused. It was also feared that Iraq would fire missiles filled with nerve agents or sarin. As a result, the Israeli government issued gas masks to its civilians. When the first Iraqi missiles hit Tel Aviv, some people injected themselves with an antidote for nerve gas. Israel was ready to respond with military force to these attacks, but agreed when asked not to by the U.S. government, who feared that if Israel became involved, the other Arab nations would either desert from the coalition or join Iraq. It was also feared that if the Israeli Air Force used Syrian or Jordanian airspace to attack Iraq, then they would intervene in the war on Iraq's side or attack Israel. Israeli policy for the previous 40 years had always been retaliation, but it was Israeli Prime Minister Yitzhak Shamir showed restraint and agreed not to retaliate in response to requests from the United States to remain out of the conflict. Then, on February 25, 1991, a Scud missile hit a U.S. Army barracks of the 14th Quartermaster Detachment out of Greensburg, Pennsylvania, stationed in Dhahran, Saudi Arabia, killing 28 soldiers and injuring over 100. For months, American units in Saudi Arabia had been under almost constant Iraqi artillery fire, as well as threats from Scud missile or chemical attacks. On February 23, 1991, the 1st Marine Division, 2nd Marine Division, and the 1st Light Armored Infantry crossed into Kuwait and headed toward Kuwait City. They encountered trenches, barbed wire, and minefields. However, these positions were poorly defended and were overrun in the first few hours. Several tank battles took place, but apart from that, coalition troops encountered minimal resistance, as most Iraqi troops surrendered. The general pattern was that the Iraqis would put up a short fight before surrendering. However, Iraqi air defenses shot down 9 American aircraft. Meanwhile, forces from Arab countries advanced into Kuwait from the east, encountering little resistance and suffering few casualties. Despite the successes of coalition forces, it was feared that the Republican Guard would escape into Iraq before it could be destroyed. It was decided to send British armed forces into Kuwait 15 hours ahead of schedule, and to send American forces after the Republican Guard. The coalition advance was preceded by a heavy artillery and rocket barrage, after which 150,000 troops and 1,500 tanks began their advance. Iraqi forces in Kuwait counterattacked against U.S. troops, acting on a direct order from Saddam himself. Despite the intense combat, the Americans repulsed the Iraqis and continued to advance towards Kuwait City. Kuwaiti forces were tasked with liberating the city. Iraqi troops offered only light resistance. The Kuwaitis lost 1 soldier killed and 1 plane shot down, and quickly liberated the city. On February 27th, Saddam ordered a retreat from Kuwait. However, an Iraqi unit at Kuwait International Airport appeared not to have gotten the message, and fiercely resisted. U.S. Marines had to fight for hours before securing the airport, after which Kuwait was declared secure. After 4 days of fighting, Iraqi forces were expelled from Kuwait. As part of a scorched earth policy, they set fire to nearly 700 oil wells, and placed landmines around the wells to make extinguishing the fires more difficult. Although it was said in Western media at the time that Iraqi troops numbered approximately 545,000 to 600,000, most experts today believe that both the qualitative and quantitative descriptions of the Iraqi army at the time were exaggerated, as they included both temporary and auxiliary support elements. Many of the Iraqi troops were young, under-resourced, and poorly trained conscripts. The coalition committed 540,000 troops, and a further 100,000 Turkish troops were deployed along the Turkish-Iraqi border. This caused a significant force delusion of the Iraqi military by forcing it to deploy its forces along all its borders. This allowed the main thrust by the U.S. to possess not only significant technological advantage, but also a numerical superiority. The widespread support for Iraq during the Iran-Iraq was equipped Iraq with the military equipment from most major world arms dealers. This resulted in a lack of standardization in this large heterogeneous force, which additionally suffered from poor training and poor motivation. The majority of Iraqi armed forces still used the old Chinese Type 59s and Type 69s, Soviet-made T-55s from the 1950s and 1960s, and some poor quality Assad Babil tanks. These machines were not equipped with up-to-date equipment such as thermal sights or laser rangefinders, and their effectiveness in modern combat was very limited. The Iraqis failed to find an effective countermeasure to the thermal sights and sabot rounds used by the coalition tanks. This equipment enabled them to engage and destroy Iraqi tanks from more than 3 times the range that Iraqi tanks could engage coalition tanks. The Iraqi crews used old, cheap steel penetrators against the advanced co-bomb armor of the U.S. and British tanks, with ineffective results. The Iraqis also failed to utilize the advantage that could be gained from using the urban warfare, fighting within Kuwait City, which could have inflicted significant casualties on the attacking forces. Urban combat reduces the range at which fighting occurs and can negate some of the technological advantages of well-equipped forces. The Iraqis also tried to use Soviet military doctrine, but the implementation failed due to the lack of skill of their commanders and the preventive coalition airstrikes on communication centers and bunkers. In Iraqi territory that was occupied by the coalition, a peace conference was held where a ceasefire agreement was negotiated and signed by both sides. At the conference, Iraq was approved to fly armed helicopters on their side of the temporary border, ostensibly for government transit due to the damage done to civilian infrastructure. Soon after, these helicopters and much of the Iraqi armed forces were used to fight a Shiite or uprising in the south. The rebellions were encouraged by an airing of the Voice of Free Iraq on February 2nd, 1991, which was broadcast from a CIA-run radio station out of Saudi Arabia. The Arabic service of the Voice was America supported the uprising by stating that the rebellion was large and that they soon would be liberated from Saddam. There was some criticism of the Bush administration as they chose to allow Saddam Hussein to remain in power instead of pushing on to capture Baghdad and overthrowing his government. In their co-written 1998 book, A World Transformed, Bush and Brent Scowcroft argued that such a course would have fractured the alliance and would have had many unnecessary political and human costs associated with it. And now back to Arthur Any More Donuts with the rest of the news.
Yes, thank you for that report. And that's all the time we have tonight. I'm your host, Arthur Any More Donuts. This is 6 o'clock news, signing off.